We thought we'd discuss the coding the flu or influenza on today's episode of Coding Corner, as so many people have recently been fighting this nasty virus this winter season.
Thanks, Hannah. If the MD indicates only flu or influenza without any further details, the alpha index leads you to unidentified influenza virus, and you should code J11.1. If the MD indicates that the patient has influenza with pneumonia, the alpha index leads you to J11.00. If other manifestations are present, find those in the list below. If additional respiratory manifestations not elsewhere classifiable are present, you will code J11.1 and use additional codes to identify acute or chronic respiratory failure, cough, or laryngitis. Coding influenza becomes tricky when the provider documentation simply states Influenza A. This does not code to J09.X2 as many coders think, as it actually codes to J10.1, identified influenza virus not elsewhere classifiable. This indicates non-novel influenza A. J10.1 is also used to code additional other identified types of influenza, such as Influenza B and C. Now I'm going to turn it over to Steph. She is going to talk about the more complex flu code J09.X2.
Thanks, Tina. J09X2 is often coded incorrectly, so let's review. In order to code influenza A using J09X2, the following must be found in the documentation. The doctor must have said or documented novel influenza A virus. Note the word novel must be found in the documentation. If it is not present and the doctor only said Influenza A, then you would code J10.1. Other documentation to look for in order to use the J09X2 code would be avian, bird, swine, other animal origin, or H5N1 types. Important tip: do not use J09X2 when documentation states novel H1N1, and instead use J10.1. Other identified influenza virus. Again, H5N1 codes to J09X2 and novel H1N1 codes to J10.1. The only difference between these two types of flu are the H5 versus H1, so be sure to review the documentation very carefully. Some other things to remember as you're coding influenza. If the provider documents suspected or possible or probable avian influenza, novel influenza, etc., then the appropriate influenza code from category J11 should be used, influenza due to unidentified influenza virus. For the purposes of coding a condition classifiable to J44.0 COPD with acute lower respiratory infection, influenza is not considered a lower respiratory infection. If influenza results in pneumonia, this is where you would code J44.0 because pneumonia is a lower respiratory infection. If the type of pneumonia is not specified, use code J11.00. If the type of pneumonia is specified, use J11.08 and then add the code for the specified pneumonia. Also, be sure to add any current or history of smoking, tobacco dependence, and exposure to tobacco smoke, if applicable.